The Journal of Agrarian Change is the leading journal of agrarian political economy. It promotes the investigation of the social relations and dynamics of production, property and power in agrarian formations and of their processes of change, both historical and contemporary. A year ago, almost to the date, and following a process riddled by struggles and vicious opposition from the extreme right, the government of Juan Manuel Santos and the FARC guerrilla signed a peace agreement bringing to an end a decades-long armed conflict in Colombia. To reflect back on the agrarian roots and the rural dynamics linked to the Colombian armed conflict and to assess the prospects for peace and reconciliation, the October edition of the Journal of Agrarian Change includes a symposium on land rights, restitution, politics and war in Colombia, edited by Christopher Cramer and Elisabeth Wood. My name is Helena Pérez Niño, and joining me to discuss this special symposium are Christopher Cramer from SOAS, University of London, Francisco Gutiérrez Sanín from Universidad Nacional and Observatorio de Restitución de Tierras, and Mauricio Velásquez Ospina from Universidad de los Andes, editors and authors of the symposium.
I think the Colombian peace process is an interesting and distinct one in terms of the extent to which the negotiations, the peace process and deal were largely determined by Colombian actors internally, domestically, albeit with some external encouragement and facilitation. One of the ways I think this is interesting is for scholars of peace transitions, peace deals, is that a lot of the literature focuses on this thing people call the liberal peace. And very often that's a little bit crudely seen as an international, a global imposition from outside on countries that pushes them towards and through this political and economic set of transitions, largely to do with liberalizing politics and democratizing and liberalizing economies through privatization, deregulation and so on. And I think what's very interesting, and it maybe helps to enrich that discussion, is here is a process where the peace process has not had that external push in the same way, but in many ways it shares some of the features because of the characteristics of Colombian political economy, which often include a liberalizing tendency, perhaps closer often to a sort of neoliberal tendencies. So it's maybe a new variant. Often when people see peace processes that have not had a major external imposition or push, they see them as illiberal peace processes. And I think this kind of helps us to sort of complicate our labels and think a little bit more in a slightly more subtle way about the nature of peace transitions. But there may be some other very intriguing aspects of this. One possible dimension here is that without such a strong external role in the peace process, there's arguably less of an external guarantor for some of the pledges around, for example, restitution and land reform. And it might be very interesting to see, I don't know whether Francisco or Mauricio have comments on that, to see how that is already playing out in a very slow process of restitution within Colombia.
This has to do with a lot of classical works in rural political economy and the roots of conflict. So remember Jeffrey Page, etc., etc. So let's say there are some, actually even Victor Moore, there are some rural economies which are directly linked to the use of violence and coercion against workers and the protests, workers and peasants and their different forms of protest and mobilization. So in Colombia we have this big cattle rancher sector which has occupied nearly half of the usable land of the country. This cattle ranching sector doesn't have clear access to public security and violence, to state-led security and violence for a lot of reasons, among them that it is programmatically anti-state because it doesn't want to be taxed. So it basically operates on the basis of private access to violence. And when the war started, then they linked this proclivity towards the use of private violence with the counterinsurgent program of the Colombian army. So cattle ranchers especially, but also other rural elites, got deeply involved in the privatization of violence, which was the specific form of answer of the Colombian state to the guerrilla challenge. And they headed most of the worst forms of victimization during the Colombian war against civilians. So I think this makes part of the Chris and Richard's program of taking society back into the analysis of war, and also goes against all these theorizations in political science that sees armed groups on the one side like a completely coherent project, etc., and on the other hand, the civilians like a simple block which is not divided by class, ethnicity, and whatnot.
So as a result of democratization, local democratization in Colombia in the mid-80s, which was the result of a peace process that failed in the mid-80s, Colombia had municipalities elect their own mayors, and it transferred a large share of the national resources to rural municipalities. And since then, 30 years ago, we observed that the rate of growth of public services in rural areas show like large variation across municipalities. So the big question is, what is driving this differentiation across municipalities? So part of the question really centered on debates about what was the kind of force coming from rural areas that was pulling local politicians to provide these services. And what we see is that municipalities where most of the land is owned by large landowners didn't have this sort of expansion of services that had other areas where what I describe as middle-sized farmers were holding a larger share of land. So the mechanism that I tried to theorize, and that I conducted extensive field work to try to document this, is that middle-sized farmers have a strong dependency on collective action, that is organizing communities to bring resources to rural areas, because they cannot provide these services privately for their lands. What you see with large landowners is that when it comes to electricity or water, they tend to prefer to pay privately for those services than paying taxes at the local level. So the communities where these middle-sized farmers were more prevalent actually exhibited a pattern of rural organization and demand for services that was more effective in driving these services.
Thank you for watching, and the full papers are available in the website of the Journal of Agrarian Change.